Ave Maris Stella.
Hello and welcome back to Vatican II in a Year. This is your host, Father Matthew Schneider. I am a priest of the Legion of Christ and a theology professor. This is a podcast on the Star Christ Production Network at sqpn.com. Today we're on day 132. We're covering Christus Dominus 25 to 26 on Coadjutor and auxiliary bishops. So, I'm going to define these two terms here. I had to define them at some point early on so you understand. So an auxiliary bishop is somebody who's a bishop or consecrated or ordained a bishop, but then has a secondary role in the diocese. They might be the number 2 in the diocese for running the diocese, or they might run one part of the diocese. Like in bigger dioceses, they'll assign regions of the diocese for them and things like that. And that's called an episcopal vicar or a vicar general if he's second for the whole diocese. And then you have coadjutor bishops. So some bishops, when they're getting older, they're getting close to 75, or they're starting to have health issues, but they aren't like totally incompetent, they'll ask the Vatican for a coadjutor bishop, who is somebody who is the auxiliary, vicar general, and has the right to succeed them once they reach 75 or once their cancer progresses too far or things like that, right? So those are the two kind of roles we're talking about here. They're kind of related, as you can tell, but and so that's, if you understand those, the rest of this follows pretty straightforwardly today. So if you want to follow along, we have a reading plan and more information, sqpn.com/Vatican, frmatthewlc.com/Vatican. Yesterday, we talked about how diocesan borders matter and should be set up following people, the population, civil borders, and we should also be concerned for other languages and other rights in the diocesan structure. We're continuing today with Chapter 2, Bishops and their particular church or diocese. We're starting Section 2.3, Assistance to the Pastoral Office of the Diocesan Bishops, and we're covering all of Section 2.3.1, Coadjutor and Auxiliary Bishops. And today is just going to be the roles of those, pretty straightforward, nothing too complicated. So first we have paragraph 25, and it has an A and a B we're going to read separately. A is talking about the auxiliary and coadjutor bishops and why they're needed, and then B is talking about the unity between the diocesan bishop, the ordinary, in that sense, the one who's in charge of the diocese, whichever term you want to use, and the auxiliaries or coadjutors. So let's read 25a. The pastoral office of bishop should be so constituted for the governing of dioceses that the good of the Lord's flock is always the supreme consideration. Rightly to achieve this goal, auxiliary bishops will frequently be appointed, because the diocesan bishop cannot personally fulfill all his episcopal duties as the good of souls demands, either because of the vast extent of his diocese or the great number of inhabitants, or because of the special nature of the apostle or other reasons of a different nature. Sometimes, in fact, a particular need requires that a coadjutor bishop be appointed to assist the diocesan bishop. Coadjutor and auxiliary bishops should be granted those faculties necessary for rendering their work more effective and safeguard the dignity proper to bishops. This, of course, should always be accomplished without detriment to the unity of the diocesan administration and the authority of the diocesan bishop. Right? We define them, and this is just saying, hey, we need them sometimes, right? Why? The biggest thing is big dioceses, right? The bishop needs to know his priests. He needs to be able to actually know what's going on in the parishes he's directly governing. So oftentimes splitting up the diocese, even though it's one structurally, splitting up into different individuals help to run it is a little more effective for management, so that all the priests in this area know that bishop, right? And that bishop knows all those priests, because the bishop can't know all 600 priests in the diocese or something, right? And then there's sometimes different groups. You might have a Spanish, English bishop, different other things, and then you'd be given the proper faculties to achieve their mission, right? So moving on to 25b, on the unity between the diocesan bishop and auxiliaries, let's read it. Furthermore, coadjutors and auxiliary bishops, since they are called to share part of the burden of diocesan bishops, so should exercise their office that they may proceed in manners in single-minded agreement with him. In addition, they should always show respect and reverence for the diocesan bishop, and he in turn should have a fraternal love for coadjutor and auxiliary bishops and hold them in esteem. Right? So these auxiliaries and the diocesan bishops should work in unity, right? That harmony, that single-mindedness, that proper reverence for the ordinary, the one who's in charge, the ordinary being the diocesan bishop, one who's in charge, right? And that's really important, because you don't want them fighting. That would just cause so much pain to the church and things. So paragraph 26, moving on, has 5 subparagraphs. We're going to read A and B together on appointing bishops when needed, and then C, D, and E together on practical rules for auxiliaries and coadjutors. So let's begin. 26a. To the extent that the good of souls demands, the diocesan bishop should not hesitate to ask the competent authority for one or more auxiliaries who will be appointed for the diocese without right of succession. B. If there is no provision for it in the letter of nomination, the diocesan bishop is to appoint his auxiliary or auxiliaries as vicars, vicar generals, or at least episcopal vicars. They should be dependent on his authority only, and he may wish to consult them in examining questions of major importance, especially of a pastoral nature. Right, so we already talked about why we need these when you can't cover everything, kind of repetition of the last paragraph, right? They should be the vicar general. So the vicar general is the number 2 in the diocese, right underneath the bishop. In smaller dioceses, it's just going to be a priest. In the bigger diocese, it's going to be one of the bishops, right? Or episcopal bishops, which usually refers to a bishop who's in charge of some area, be it geographic or like all the Hispanic ministry or something like that in the diocese, right? And they still depend on the ordinary's authority. They can't just do like certain things without the ordinary. We're not going to get too into detail here because it's, it doesn't really affect most of us in our daily lives. And the people who are working will know exactly which is which, and it can vary diocese to diocese based on what delegation the diocesan bishop is given. So I don't want to get too into the weeds here because it doesn't really change it that much. But anyways, moving on to the final 3 subparagraphs on practical rules for auxiliaries and coadjutors. So let's begin. 26a. Unless competent authority is otherwise determined, the powers and faculties which auxiliary bishops have by law do not cease when the office of the diocesan bishop comes to an end. It is also desirable that when the see is vacant, the office of ruling the diocese, unless some serious reasons persuade otherwise, should be committed to the auxiliary bishop, or when there are more than one, when there are more than one, to one of the auxiliaries. D. A coadjutor bishop appointed with the right of succession must always be named vicar general by the diocesan bishop. In particular cases, the competent authority can grant him even more extensive faculties. E. In order to provide for the greatest possible present and future good of the diocese, the diocesan bishop and his coadjutor should not fail to consult with each other in matters of great importance. Right, so the first, this paragraph C is pretty straightforward. Just basically when the bishop dies or when he passes away, the powers these bishops have continue on with us to do confirmation, things like that, right? And also, one of them should be named in succession, right? Sometimes that can be done beforehand, in case, and you should have some paperwork for that in case the bishop dies, like who's gonna do what. But then also, sometimes the Vatican will appoint somebody specific when it's a retirement or when the bishop turns 75 or something to be like kind of the interim running the diocese, right? In that sede vacante. Sede vacante just means the chair is empty, the see is empty, so the see, that diocese, there's no one running it, no bishop there. And then it notes that the coadjutor must be the vicar general, so he must be the number 2 in charge because he's going to take over, right? And he needs to work in harmony with the ordinary, right? So that's pretty straightforward. Because he's going to become the ordinary. And usually, at least on our practical terms, the diocesan bishop gets a degree of consideration who's going to be his coadjutor. They don't just name those kind of there's less kind of just naming them apart from the current diocesan bishop if it's a coadjutor. So it's a little hint. If your diocese gets a coadjutor bishop, it's probably going to continue on a similar path. So anyways, thank you for listening to this episode of Vatican II in a Year. This is a listener-supported podcast. You can help StarQuest produce it. Another great podcast at sqpn.com/give. You can give one-time monthly or join the StarQuest Patreon. Tomorrow we're going to continue with the next paragraph of Christus Dominus 27 on the diocesan curia, basically all those offices, like the diocesan offices, what kind of things are going on in there. We're going to do it more generally, not what's going on in your specific diocese. Please join us then to learn more about Vatican II, which provide a blueprint for the Catholic Church. Go to sqpn.com/Vatican, frmatthewlc.com/Vatican, or Vatican SQPN on Facebook and X for more information on the podcast, such as playlists for individual documents and a reading plan. We also set up an email for questions and comments at Vatican2@sqpn.com, Vatican, the number 2 at sqpn.com, or my website, frmatthewlc.com, has a contact form. Amen.